On Sunday morning, Wall Street became a tourist stop. Tour buses rolled into the financial district and unloaded people who wanted to see the place where the money had bled out. They stood under the New York Stock Exchange, looking for visible wreckage, broken glass, shell casings, some physical sign that the week had actually happened. Above them, the carved figure of integrity still watched from the exchange pediment. Below, the crowd stared back at a building that had just taught the country a new kind of fear. This is the contradiction. After Black Thursday, America kept acting as if confidence could be manufactured by ritual, speeches, dinners, and closed-door meetings. But the evidence was already moving the other way. The panic had not ended. It had changed rooms. On Monday, October 28, Charles Mitchell walked to National City hoping the public would believe in the banker's pool. The market answered almost immediately. Selling began at the open. U.S. steel fell again. The familiar blue chips were hit so hard that Richard Whitney's presence on the floor no longer looked like command. This time, simply being seen near the post could not summon buyers. The bankers met again, but the rescue had changed shape. On Thursday, they had tried to support confidence. Now they were trying to find air pockets where there were no bids at all. At the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, officials reviewed strained bank borrowing and emergency advances. No decisive answer came. At Morgan, the bankers avoided a grand statement and said only that they would try to keep the market orderly. Then Mitchell returned to his own office and learned what had happened while he was away. National City had bought an enormous block of its own shares, trying to hold up the price needed for a merger. The number was not just large. It was dangerous enough to threaten the bank itself. Mitchell's public role was confidence. His private problem was survival. That night, Mitchell went to Bernard Baruch's house for a dinner in honor of Winston Churchill. It was the kind of room that had made the boom feel inevitable: bankers, industrialists, editors, financiers, men who had spent years converting optimism into authority. Mitchell walked into it carrying a secret. His own institution was exposed, and he needed to look as if nothing essential had changed. At the table, the mood was almost buoyant. Men who had lost fortunes could still imagine buying good companies cheap. The language of bargain hunting returned quickly, because it was less frightening than saying the rescue had failed. Baruch was different. He had been reading about crowd madness before the crash and had sold heavily before the worst days. But even that fact stayed mostly private. In public, the dinner performed resilience. That was the weekend's deeper failure. The men with the best information could admit fear only in side rooms, cables, and loans. Over brandy, they spoke as if recovery were a matter of holding one's nerve. On Tuesday morning, Mitchell decided to use his own credit to protect National City. He crossed to Morgan and asked Lamont and George Whitney for a loan. The request put pride, reputation, and family wealth on the line. Morgan agreed, not out of affection, but because a failure at National City could damage nearly every major bank. Meanwhile, the exchange floor was being overwhelmed again. Buyers disappeared. The governing board called a secret emergency meeting, not in its formal room, but in a cramped cellar space under the trading floor. Lamont and Whitney slipped across as quietly as they could. Inside, smoke thickened under a low ceiling. Governors sat on tables, stood in corners, and listened as new price declines arrived. The ticker was behind. Phone lines were jammed. Paperwork had overflowed ordinary boxes and spilled into waste baskets. Clerks and messengers had been sleeping near their work. The question was whether to close the exchange. Closing might look like protection. It might also create street markets, freeze loans backed by stock, and convince the public that the authorities had lost control. So the governors chose a smaller fiction, special holidays and shorter sessions, explained as mercy for exhausted workers. The market stayed open because closing it might have told too much truth. By the end of Black Tuesday, more than 16 million shares had traded. The day's losses were too large to translate cleanly into ordinary life. After the close, people moved through Wall Street as if stunned. One banker kept processing loan takeovers until an assistant finally told him his bank had failed. A financier refused desperate loan requests because saving a friend today could mean losing both friend and money tomorrow. At the Cellar, Netherlands, music and champagne continued above the city even as one guest in the elevator called it the darkest day in American history. Jesse Livermore went home to Long Island and found his house partly emptied. Paintings, rugs, and jewels had been moved to the chauffeur's apartment. His wife had heard the crash news and assumed they had been ruined too. Livermore had to explain the cruel reversal. He had been short. As others lost money, he had made a fortune. The crash had become morally confusing. The same falling prices that destroyed one household could enrich another. That is why reassurance alone could not heal the country. People were already asking who had profited, who had lied, and who deserved blame. By November 8, the crash had moved beyond prices. John Raskob received an urgent call and rushed to Greenwich Village. James Riordan, president of County Trust Company and a close friend in New York's political and banking world, had taken his own life. Behind the personal tragedy was an institutional danger. County Trust depositors were already nervous. If the news broke too soon, the bank could face a run. Raskob, Ull Smith, and others tried to manage the disclosure until the bank could close for the day and its accounts could be reviewed. The public explanation had to be timed like a market operation. Even grief had become a confidence problem. The bank survived after emergency backing was arranged. But the scene revealed what the crash had done. It turned friendship into collateral. It turned a death in a bedroom into a question about deposits, audits, and Monday morning withdrawals. At the same time, Livermore discovered that being right about falling prices made him a public villain. Threats reached his home. He tried to reverse the story by announcing that stocks had fallen too far. On the very day that confidence appeared in the papers, the market hit a new low for the year. Hoover had wanted to treat the crash as separate from the real economy. That became harder by mid-November. Andrew Mellon, Roy Young, and Ogden Mills came early to the White House to brief him. Mellon still believed liquidation could be cleansing. Hoover was reluctant to feed alarm with words, but letters from officials and friends warned that fear was moving into banks and businesses outside New York. So Hoover spoke in the careful language he preferred. The country, he said in effect, should not confuse market pessimism with the basic strength of business. He wanted action more than rhetoric, faster public works, meetings with industrial leaders, coordinated confidence. But Hoover's problem was not only policy. It was emotional authority. Businessmen came to Washington and said supportive things, while some privately left unsure what exactly had been decided. Henry Ford offered wage increases and made himself look like the heartland answer to Wall Street. Then Blaine found a sharper voice. In the Senate, Carter Glass returned to Charles Mitchell. To Glass, Mitchell's bank had fed the speculative excess and then helped produce the disaster. The next day, Mitchell's picture became a national symbol of culpability. The crash was no longer just a market event. It was becoming a political case. In December, New York tried to look normal. Christmas windows glowed on Fifth Avenue. Shoppers admired expensive displays while a Salvation Army Santa warned that conditions among the poor were being ignored. The pit for the Empire State Building had been dug. The Chrysler Building was rising. To many New Yorkers, steel and stone still looked more convincing than the stock tape. Mitchell, meanwhile, looked for a way to turn his own losses into a tax advantage without signaling weakness. He arranged to sell National City shares to his wife, privately, through letters, while assuring her the stock was undervalued and the bank sound. At year-end, the exchange staged its own exorcism. A band played on the floor. Families watched from the galleries. Traders cheered the passing of 1929 and tried to burn the memory of October out of the room. The final numbers even allowed denial. The Dow was down for the year, but not so far that veterans could not tell themselves they had seen worse. Yet something essential had shifted. The common investor who had entered the market to avoid missing the future now had less money, less credit, and less trust. Wall Street could celebrate the end of the year. It could not make the public come back. The panic ended on the calendar before it ended in American life.